There's a question that I like to ask myself when I start to worry, when I start to get anxious or start to think about something that, this could end badly. I start to reflect on some failure that I've kind of participated in and thinking the trajectory. I ask myself, what's the worst that could happen? And what happens after that? I actually find this a good question. It's a confronting question. It gets the brutal facts on the table. Because let's face it, there are circumstances in life when the worst could be pretty bad. I find myself asking this question when I'm facing an exam or a test or something where I'm being evaluated. I might ask this question when I'm traveling somewhere in the world. Things start to just kind of go wrong, or a train of thought in my head, and I start to worry, this could go bad. Or if I start to think about something where I have, maybe not done my best, or I've failed in some way. And in all those scenarios, things can go pretty bad. And when you start to think about the worst that could happen, it really gets the brutal, dark truth on the table. But the part of that question that is so life-giving is, what happens after that? Because if I think about the worst that could happen as I'm traveling, and some catastrophe, some terrible thing, let's face it, we'll die. But what happens after that? If I think about the consequences of a failure, something that, oh my goodness, everybody sees me and my reputation and all of this in this dark way. But what happens after that? To run into the loving arms of Jesus and to be embraced in his care and his forgiveness. Good Friday is a day in which we face the worst. It's a day in which we chase all of those lines of thought and all of those lines of worry, and we take our worst fears, our worst sins, our worst picture of ourselves and our worst picture of the world, and we confront it directly. We take it to the cross and we let God deal with it. This is what Good Friday is all about. The disciples, as they were walking toward the first Good Friday, were doing exactly this. They were starting to pursue in their own minds and in their own thinking, what's the worst that could happen? Palm Sunday had been amazing. Celebration, everybody aligned. Jesus had put the religious rulers in their place. The people were praising and celebrating him. The disciples could see themselves enthroned in victory in Jesus' new kingdom. Sure, there was that moment when Jesus was crying and weeping. That was a bit embarrassing. But for the most part, it was an exciting day. But that thing about Jesus and the tears and then what he's been saying in these last days and the way he's been talking about dying for sins and about the authorities arresting him and all this stuff, the disciples are starting to pursue in their own minds what's the worst that could happen. And they can see the collapse of this mission of Jesus. They can see death for him and perhaps for themselves, and they are starting to worry. And in the context of all of this, what's the worst that could happen? Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Good Friday is a day to face the worst. And I want to invite you today to face the worst as we reflect on the death of Jesus Christ and the hope of the world. Let's hear the narrative of Jesus' crucifixion read from Mark's Gospel, chapter 15.
It was the third hour when they crucified him. The written notice of charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down from the cross so that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God."
The death of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I want you to take a moment and to focus your very worst on the cross. If you have made a cross as a family and it's in the room with you now, can I invite you to focus your very worst, your worst fears and worries, your worst sins and failings, your worst thoughts about the world and its brokenness and where it could go, and focus them on the cross. If you don't have a cross in the room with you, just focus your attention on the cross here. Draw up into your mind an image of what Jesus has done for us, and take just a moment and put your worst on the cross. That's what Good Friday is about, confronting the worst. And so this raises the question, as we put our worst on the cross, how is it that Jesus can say to us, "Don't let your hearts be troubled"? How is it that Jesus can say to us, "I am the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life"? Jesus spoke those words to the disciples in the midst of a Passover meal and a gathering where they were acknowledging the moment. In a few moments, we will celebrate communion together, and we will eat and we will drink as Jesus did with his disciples, and focus our attention on this moment, on the gift of the cross, when Jesus confronts the worst of the worst and says to us, "Don't let your hearts be troubled." So at the end of that time when Jesus was with his disciples, John's Gospel, chapter 14, it says just before they left, Jesus said an astonishing thing to them. He said, I'm not going to say much more to you now because the prince of this world is coming. It's a reference to Satan, the accuser, the evil one. And he has no hold on me, Jesus says. But he comes to show the world how much I love the Father and how I will obey the Father, whatever he asks. This little picture of how the communion meal ends and how Jesus gathers up his disciples and they walk toward the worst of the worst is so significant for us. Jesus knows what's happening. He knows what evil is coming against him. But he says to his disciples that although the prince of this world is coming, he has no hold on me. Jesus will take the worst of the worst in each of our lives and push into a future that is unimaginable. What's the worst that could happen? And what happens after that? So in the New Testament, we see a pattern that Jesus embraces, and it happens again and again and again, and it happens on the cross. It is the pattern of redemption. It is the pattern of hope. The things that Jesus touches, the people that Jesus is with, the occasions where Jesus is present, things change. In the first century, they had a very strong notion of sin and illness and brokenness being contagious. And so the way they battled against sin and evil is they practiced a kind of spiritual isolation. We are living in a context where we're very aware of the contagion of the COVID-19 virus. We're very aware of this disease. And so we are distancing ourselves from each other so we won't catch the disease. In the first century, they thought not only of physical illness, but of spiritual illness and relational illnesses in this same way. So they had rules about isolating yourself and insulating yourself from other people. You don't touch someone who is unclean. You don't mingle with someone whose behaviors are not true and right. You don't support someone who's not aligned with your views and with the views of the nation. And so this led to all kinds of divisions and all kinds of separations. And Jesus comes into the midst of this and he seems to break all the rules. But every time he does, miracles occur. Amazing things happen. So there is a leper very early in the story of Jesus, and everybody says, leprosy, contagious, get away, this is dangerous. And Jesus goes toward that person, embraces them with love, and instead of the illness coming to Jesus' wholeness and health floods that individual's life. They become healed. They become changed. This happens again with a woman who had a constant bleeding that caused her to be unclean in the religious sense, and so confronted physically and so depleted in her life. She looked for an opportunity and she touched Jesus, and when she just touched the corner of his cloak, she became well. He did not become unclean. This amazing pattern continues all the way through the Gospels. Jesus was walking with his disciples one day near a town by the name of Nain, and there was a funeral coming out of the town. A widow who was grieving. She'd already lost her husband. Now she had lost her son. Jesus was moved with compassion, and he went to them, and he touched the grave briar. He touched the coffin. And everybody was aghast. You don't touch a dead body. It's contagious and spiritually unclean, and it's dangerous. But no ill health came to Jesus. No uncleanness touched him. Instead, his life flowed into that young man who sat up in his funeral briar. This pattern keeps repeating. It is the way of Jesus. He comes into the things that are broken and unwell and troublesome, the worst of the worst, and he addresses them. And when everybody is waiting for the contagion to touch Jesus, for him to be unclean, for him to be unwell, for him to collapse, it doesn't happen. He keeps pushing into the brokenness of our world and bringing change. He comes to Jericho with his disciples, and there is a bit of a parade to welcome him. The streets are crowded. Jesus notices one man who has climbed a tree to watch him come to town. The one man, Zacchaeus, is a conspirator with the Roman Empire. He gathers up taxes. He's aligned himself with the invasive power. Nobody has any time for Zacchaeus. And Jesus says, I've got time for you, Zacchaeus. In fact, I'm going to stay at your place tonight. So let's eat and let's talk and let's share company together. The whole town muttered when they saw what Jesus was doing. He's breaking all the spiritual isolation rules. That's shocking. But what happens the next day is that Jesus and Zacchaeus come out of that house, and Zacchaeus is a different person. He's not the greedy, money-grabbing person aligned with Roman power for his own personal interest. He's become aligned with the kingdom of God and the generosity of the heart of God, and he's giving his money away, and he's caring for the poor, and he's living a whole different possibility. This is the way it is with Jesus. This is the good news of the kingdom of God. And we see it repeating again and again and again. There are various places and various contexts and various relationships that the whole culture is thinking that will destroy you. But every time, Jesus brings life and hope, and instead of him being infected, others receive life. It happens again on the cross on Good Friday, where they nail him to the center cross with a thief on each side. Thief is too weak a word. The Romans did not crucify pickpockets. The word that's used literally means a revolutionary. These were people leading others in revolt. These were terrorists of the day who were crucified on either side of Jesus, and they put Jesus between them to make a clear statement. This is who Jesus is. He calls himself a king. He thinks he can rule over people with all his gentleness and sweetness. Well, let us show you what happens to people who posture as kings, not giving authority to the Caesars and the Sanhedrin and the rulers of this world. And so they were intending to place him in such a way that his reputation would be tarnished, that his whole mission would be tarnished, that his body would be broken, that his life would be spent, and that the whole thing would end. And there on the cross, we see this same pattern. Instead of the revolutionaries reaching out and touching Jesus and diminishing him into their reputation, Jesus touches the heart of one of those revolutionaries who speaks to him and to his colleague and says, this man is innocent. Jesus, you're innocent. We should be dying. You shouldn't be here. And then he says, rescue me, Jesus. Help me, forgive me. Let me be a part of your kingdom. And Jesus embraces him into paradise and says, this day you will be with me. Even that picture of painting Jesus as a revolutionary is reversed and transitioned by the love of God and the power of Jesus. And this, of course, leads us to the most critical moment, when Jesus touches death itself. When Jesus touches the deep, profound brokenness of the cosmos. This is the pattern that the Gospels have been following all along. Every brokenness, every sickness, every evil that Jesus touches, he reverses what is happening. The prince of this world is coming, Jesus says. I'm going to stop talking and start acting. The prince of this world is coming, but he has no hold on me. He comes so that the world can see that I love the Father and I do whatever he asks me to do. And thank God for the obedience of Jesus, who touched lepers and let a bleeding woman touch him, and touched the greedy and touched the revolutionary and brought change to all of that, and then ultimately touched death itself, touched the brokenness of cosmos itself to turn the world inside out so that God could know our death and we could know his life. Jesus did an amazing miracle, very much like the first miracle that God did in creation when he took a clay form and breathed his own life into that clay form, and we became independent, thinking, living beings with a will of our own, bearing the image of God. And then, expressing that will rebelliously and in broken ways, we confounded our own lives and our relationships, and the choices that have flowed on through centuries and millennia have affected the brokenness of the entire world. Jesus did a miracle in which he reversed all of that brokenness. And with the same power that God breathed life into us, so Jesus took death into the Godhead so that we could have his life. This is a picture of how much Jesus loves the Father and how he obeys him and how that love is for all of us. This was an action so that we could be brought into that love of God and into that family of trust and blessing and peace and hope. What's the worst that could happen? Put your worst on the cross. The very worst worry, the very worst fear that you have in the midst of this worldwide crisis, what's the worst that could happen? Put it on the cross. And know that Jesus, who gave himself on that cross, will take the worst that could happen. And what happens next? Jesus will take that and heal it. He will take your worst fear, your worst sin, your darkest thoughts about the world, and he can heal it. The worst that could happen, and what happens next? On Sunday, we'll push in with joy and celebration to what happens next. Because the death of Jesus is not the end of the story, it is the pinnacle, the moment at which Jesus allows everything that is broken to touch him, and he with purpose touches death and sin and evil, which has no hold on him. As you focus on the cross, put your worst there and let Jesus touch it. We're going to take just a moment and celebrate the communion meal. It's an opportunity for us to think of ourselves right there with the disciples in the room as Jesus was having this conversation. It's a moment for us to think about putting our worst on the cross and then letting Jesus' very best touch our souls. So if you have something to eat and something to drink, could you just prepare with your family, with those who are with you? If you're alone and you're in a context where you don't have something to eat, something to drink, just join with me here and be a part of this moment. And let these truths nourish your spirit. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, He was with his disciples and he was teaching them these things. And he took bread and he broke it. And he said to them, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." I'd invite you to take the food that you have to share. Give each member of the family, each one who's present with you, something to eat. And as we eat, just be quiet in heart and in mind, and let the love of Jesus Christ touch your soul. Let the kindness and grace and forgiveness and wonder of God speak to your life. Just share in food together with those who are near to you. After the supper, Jesus took a cup of wine, and he shared it with his disciples, saying that this was a new agreement, a new covenant between God and all of humanity, a new covenant made possible in his blood. The blood that absorbed the worst of humanity's failings to give us the hope and life of God. As you have something to drink, just share it with those who are with you. And as we drink together, can I remind you of the importance of taking these truths into our hearts and lives? As you put your worst on the cross today, take the forgiveness of Jesus into your thinking, into your emotions, into your heart of hearts. Let it affect your will. Let it shape your life. As you put your worst on the cross today, welcome the gift of salvation that Jesus gives. And as you drink, give thanks to God for the incredible love that he has for you. Let's drink with thankful hearts. This meal is a meal to remember. And we do this remembering the cross of Jesus, where all that is evil and wrong, the worst of the worst, is reversed into life and hope. We do this until Jesus comes again. May the Lord of life touch your heart and change your life in this season as you bring your very worst to the cross and experience his gift of wonderful life.